When rethinking the line in poetry, I think it's helpful to kind of go back and look at some basic American traditions that are present in defining that line. Um, Poets who write in free verse tend to gravitate towards some models that are kind of established and traditional, but also are kind of breaking those traditions down and exploring new things. So we'll look at the lines posed by Dickinson, Whitman, and Baraka here. First, look at Emily Dickinson's line in the poem. Dickinson writes a much shorter, kind of driven line that's end stopped, that's bits and pieces of language that are complete units within the line usually. You can see in these bits of language that have moments of rhyme. Sometimes feel almost forced into rhyme by Dickinson. It shows a lot of the influence of hymnody and song on her poems, that they feel like hymn lines sometimes. Sometimes what I would like call almost lyrical obsessions about finding those rhymes and kind of the playfulness of those rhymes, offering means of understanding the world. Take for example this example from the text. We like March, his shoes are purple, he is new and high, makes he mud for dog and peddler, makes he forests dry. One thing to note here, right, is the punctuation of Dickinson's lines. Sometimes they're not punctuated at all, but sometimes she uses those double dashes with the more traditional punctuation. How do you read those kind of breaks within the line? Do you read the double dash as a longer break than a comma, perhaps, but shorter than a period? When you look at the movement from one line to the next, do you read the full line and then break into the next one so it feels end stopped, like it's a complete thought or a complete unit of thought? Dickinson's line offers one alternative here, one that is very lyrical, but also kind of has a certain kind of meaning to how it is kind of feel. Sometimes it feels a little almost truncated. In comparison, another traditional line in American poetry was set up by Walt Whitman. Whitman writes with a much longer line, as you might note in the text examples, a line that's exuberant, that almost, as Coke notes, brings in the whole world and addresses the whole world as Whitman kind of unwinds his poem. The Whitman, almost feels like he's trying to craft this new American epic that's going to replace the old classical epics of Homer. And so Whitman's trying to bring conversational speech into the poem with these long lines, where he's trying to, almost copy the patterns of American speech that he hears around him in the cities in which he writes and lives. For example, from Song of Myself, some of the lines in the text: I chant a new chart of dilation or pride. We have had enough ducking and deprecating about enough. I show that size is only development. Have you outstripped the rest? Are you the president? Whitman unwinds these kind of long lines to kind of think about the expansiveness of America, to think about the expansiveness of American dream and speech, of how do you bring a developing land, a developing people into the poem. How do you try to think about the exuberance of change and say all of it within a line. Note that the lines go on, even though they feel complete. He wants to write the complete thought within a line. The line runs over, on the page. You can't fit all of the line into a line on the page. So a lot of times you'll see these longer lines that kind of feel Whitman's exuberance in singing America on the page. Think about that sense of page and American voice, right? How do you get the voices that you've heard in your experience onto the page within writing? One of the questions I always ask, in terms of how you think about line is, where is the poet or the speaker of the poem speaking from? And so locality locality is speech that you know, the speech you've grown up with, speech you've heard since you were a young child. How are you trying to kind of like perhaps get that kind of speech into a poem or into a poetic line? The conversations that you've overheard. How does that perhaps define the speech that you're trying to engage in the poem? So you can think about like the geographies that you've experienced in your own life as a writer of poetry. Like they could be, you could be trying to copy or mimic a sense of the speech that you've heard in the places that you've known well, or does that come out maybe perhaps in an experience of displacement? You've been plucked up and put down in a different place, and you're trying to remember, recall, engage, copy the speech that you've heard in these other places where you've been. In what ways does the line offer us a sense of a remeasured America, or remeasured American speech? One of the problems, of course, here that you can also think about is how American speech is drawn from so many currents throughout the world, how it's so impacted, how the English that's spoken is so impacted by immigration experiences of displacement, new words, invented words always coming into the language, that the language never seems finished, that there are always new ways of speaking, new ways of describing experience, new ways of crafting the sentence. How does American speech wrap its mouth around Native American place names, right? So many of the place names are rooted in Native American space, and how does English, an imported language, wrap itself around the places that have been named from its past? Also, one thing that and this is particularly true with Whitman and Dickinson here, right, is what kinds of mythic spaces are invoked within a language, right? That you'll see, that there's a kind of pastoral America that's set up in their speech in the poems. A sense of an America that's tied to farm and country and land, of wide open spaces. Dickinson engages that, right, by writing these short, kind of contained, isolated lines, that are explosive because they're so short. Whitman just lets it all go out on the page, right? He allows the line to kind of spill out all over the place and sprawl. Also, you can think about the kind of mythic cities that Whitman's engaging, right? That he wants to bring all of the city's experience into his lines, and so they kind of sprawl across the page like American cities sprawl into their environs. Against these two, right, you can also think about some of the new traditions that have arisen within American poetries, and I've asked you to kind of read the poems of Amiri Baraka as well here. Baraka's poems, coming in the late 20th century, the mid to late 20th century, offered kind of a renewed sense of a speaking eye, an African American man speaking within and against the world in which he's placed. They reflect Baraka's urban experience in Newark, New Jersey, and try to gather bits and pieces of that world, individual fragments of experience, of seeing, of hearing. He's trying to pull all that stuff together. And the influence of jazz on Baraka here is really important, right? That the lines are often enjammed, right? That they run over into the next line. The sentence runs over into the next line of poetry. And there are the kind of syncopated effects that you'll see as you read Baraka's poems from the text. Just to look at a quick example here, right, is from Baraka's poem, "Morning uptown, quiet on the street, no matter the distinctions that can't be made quiet, very quiet on the street." The poem goes on from there, but just to note a few things with the lines here, right, that they are enjammed, right? The sentences, this is one sentence that spills on over 3 lines. So why does Baraka make that break after "can be" in the second line here, right? No matter the distinctions that can be, you can read that as a separate line, right? That the distinctions are kind of carved in stone or carved in the street, but they're made. And they can be made quiet, very quiet on the street. So there's a nice complication here in terms of Baraka's experience of this urban world, right? In the morning, the distinctions that are so apparent on the street that seem so cut into stone are ultimately kind of made by its citizens. And in this poem particularly, those distinctions are dissolved, and the experience that he feels with a boy who's on the street as well in the morning. So these three poets offer some great ways of thinking about the line and thinking about how you fit American speech onto the page in the poem.